flow into the hand, the ventral hand, and form palmar arches. So they're going to flow into the hand here and form two arches, a superficial one and a deep. The ulnar artery runs along the groove with the ulnar nerve here. Remember the pisiform and the hook of the hamate? You can feel those bumps there. And flows in, and it creates the greatest volume of blood for the superficial palmar arch. So this vessel is going to narrow as it flows into the radial artery. So this is the superficial palmar arch. The radial artery sends a major branch around the lateral aspect of the thumb, and it dives in through this web space between the thumb and the forefinger and joins a smaller branch. Drew this on the wrong side here because it's actually the deep branch doesn't extend quite as distal. So the radial artery is the primary source of blood flow for the deep palmar branch. Or arch. So I'm going to put ulnar in parentheses here. That's the primary source of blood. So it's going to be wide and then taper more narrow as it flows into with radial. And then ulnar, the deep palmar arch is going to be primarily radial artery as its source of blood. Now coming off of the arch, primarily the superficial arch, we have pairs of vessels. These pairs of vessels travel on each side of the digits. So rather than down the center of the digit, they're going to pass on the medial and lateral surfaces of digits, which is where we find the nerves. So a few years ago, it's been about 10 years now maybe, I slammed the door on my finger of the Suburban. I've done it to my son. I would prefer to do it to myself. But I did it this way rather than this way. Okay, so doing it this way completely destroyed the nerve. So the tip of my finger was numb for about 3 weeks until the peripheral nerve grew back. If I did it this way, it would have hurt a lot, but it wouldn't have stayed numb because the nerve wouldn't have been destroyed. Okay, so nerves and arteries for each of the fingers is going to travel on the medial and lateral aspect of each digit. And those are just called digital arteries. The ones that are in the palm are called common. The ones in the finger are called proper, but you don't need to worry about that level, just digital arteries to the digits. Okay, so that's enough level of detail there. Okay, so that's blood supply to the upper limb. So if we were to trace a drop of, if I said trace a drop of blood from the heart to the little finger, we would go ascending aorta, arch of the aorta. Now I would have to tell you right or left so you'd know whether or not to take the brachiocephalic trunk. If I said right, you would take the brachiocephalic trunk to subclavian, just like telling somebody the streets to go on. Axillary, brachial, and I said little finger, so we're going to go ulnar, and then digital superficial palmar arch and digital arteries. Okay? Since we're in the ulnar side, we're more likely to go superficial palmar arch than deep palmar arch. If you're on the radial side, you're more likely to go deep palmar arch because the greater volume of blood flow is into the deep palmar arch. So when you're practicing these pathways, remember the pathways are your extra credit for the upcoming exam. I'll say trace a drop of blood from, which means you're in veins, so from the top of the foot to the stomach. So you take it back to the heart. We'll do those veins on Tuesday, and then out the heart. You don't have to follow it to the lungs and back again, okay? And then out to the stomach or wherever. There are lecture questions, and you'll get two, so you'll get to choose which one you want to do. And there are sample ones with answers on D2L. The lecture type questions will not be tracing questions so much as, for something like this, obviously, which of the following provides the greatest blood volume to the superficial palmar arch? And it's going to be the ulnar artery. The thyrocervical trunk is a branch of which of the following arteries? The really easy one, the brachial artery divides to form which of the following pairs of vessels? So those are the types of lecture questions on those components. All right, so now let us look at the anterior chest and posterior chest blood supply. We've done the baseline for this already by looking at the internal thoracic arteries that we put on the board on Tuesday, or I put on the board and you watched. So internal thoracic arteries descend from the subclavian artery just lateral to the deep sternum, so now inside of the chest wall. And they're going to be about an inch or so, inch and a half lateral to the lateral borders of the sternum. Their branches are then lateral. So let me label this one. Now we're going to just look at their intercostal branches. They also provide branches to the diaphragm from above and anastomose with those inferior epigastric arteries we talked about with the reproductive system. Okay, but we're not learning all the blood vessels in the body. So with internal thoracic, we're just going to stop with the internal anterior intercostals. So these are going to descend down the chest wall toward the diaphragm, and again, I'm not following them completely. Major branches are lateral. Obviously, this is more than 2 inches or 3 inches apart. Okay? In real life, the internal thoracics are about this far apart. So I've just kind of done some artistic licensing here. And branching off of the internal thoracic are small vessels that are going to travel between each rib. And we call the muscles between the ribs intercostal muscles, and the nerves that innervated those ribs, the intercostal nerves. And so these are the intercostal arteries. But we have two sources for the intercostal arteries. These that are running along the anterior and partial lateral aspect of the chest are the anterior intercostals. Coming off of the aorta and wrapping around to meet them, forming a U between the two of them, are the posterior intercostals. All right?
Those come off the descending.
They come off the thoracic aorta, which is the first part of the descending. So anterior intercostal arteries. Posterior intercostal arteries are going to be, again, from the posterior aspects of the aorta. They are paired. And my things don't line up here quite accurately enough, but they're going to come off, again, from the posterior surface and wrap around and become the same vessel. So they definitely anastomose. It's not like they're off. Okay, they join to become the same vessel. So these are the posterior intercostals. So we're supplying the muscles of the chest wall with anterior and posterior intercostals. How about the organs of the thoracic cavity? What are we supplying the heart with? How is the heart getting its oxygenated blood? Coronary arteries. Okay, the ones we looked at yesterday and previously with the heart itself. All right, what other organ do we find, major pair of organs do we find in the thoracic cavity? The lungs. So how do we supply the lungs with blood? Pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries are definitely carrying blood to the lung. Is it oxygenated or deoxygenated? It's deoxygenated. So that's not going to help the lung tissue, which is metabolically active. We've got muscles and cartilage and epithelial tissue and other connective tissues in the lung. So the lung needs its own oxygen supply. And that comes off of the aorta. I've drawn this arch relatively high. It's really probably only like this. Okay, so but the descending is It's very close to the pulmonary vessels, so it's not going to be this offset that I kind of have here. But we have going to right and left lungs, pulmonary trunks. I'm going to color that in solid so it shows out a little bit more. Did I say pulmonary trunks? I'm sorry. Bronchial arteries, because they travel with the bronchi. So these are bronchial arteries. Don't let that be a trick question, right? So which of the following carry oxygenated blood to the lungs? It's not pulmonary trunk. It's not pulmonary veins because it's going to the lungs. It's going to be bronchial arteries. Okay? I will groan if any of you missed that question on the exam.
Gretchen.
All right, so now we've taken blood up the ascending aorta, up to the head, out and down the lower limbs. We've supplied the anterior chest wall, posterior chest wall, ribs, lungs. Now we're going to move into the abdominal cavity. Okay. So the thoracic aorta stops where it passes through the diaphragm. Actually, it's the diaphragm, but it's kind of wrapped around it because it's a very posterior structure. But there's an opening in the diaphragm for the aorta. And once we find it in the abdominal cavity, it's now known as, big surprise, the abdominal aorta. Right. So I'm going to erase this diagram right here. These are the terms for the vessels we're going to label on the abdominal aorta, and I will diagram it here. String is like having bags in my eyes.
Throw it up there.
So the aorta is slightly to the left of center. It's traveling down the left side of the vertebral column. So we have it slightly to the left of center where it passes through the diaphragm. Now just a word of warning to keep things straight. I'm going to draw my aorta all the way down the board, and then I'm going to go back and erase in it openings for the arteries that branch off. So if you're drawing this, you may want to wait unless you can erase that. Otherwise, you're going to have lines blocking those branches.
Oh, shit.
Pressure in the abdominal aorta is still high. It's a little warm to lay out in your bikini and Speedos. But if you were to do so and lie on your back, you could actually see your abdomen rise and fall with the expansion of the abdominal aorta. Even though it's behind the intestines and back 3 or 4 inches along the abdominal wall, you can still see its pressure causing that anterior abdominal wall and cavity to rise and fall. All right, so abdominal aorta was a weird number over here. 46? Oh, 46, abdominal aorta. So we'll just put that down here. Okay, now, most of the arteries in the abdominal aorta are supplying organs. And so they are named for the organs to which they are carrying blood, to which they are carrying blood. We only have one liver. So the hepatic artery is going to be a single vessel. We only have one stomach, but we send several arteries to it, okay? But most of the time we have single vessels going to our organs that are named for that organ. They might receive branches from other organs, but we have 2 kidneys, so we have